Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to Vintage on Tap. My name is Bianca. So in this video, we are completing our McCall's video series. I sewed Vintage Vogue V9280. So this video is just gonna focus completely on the sewing process from beginning to end. If you guys have not seen the fitting and the technique video that precede this series, please go ahead and watch those. I'll have them linked down in the description below. You know, heads up in terms of this project, there are a lot of steps, but definitely don't let that intimidate you. I completed my dress over a couple weeks, just a little bit here and there, but there is a lot of hand sewing. I know a lot of people get really intimidated by that sort of thing. Don't be intimidated. Every technique is pretty straightforward, so let's go ahead and get started. First things first, you're going to work on the back. Now you have to be mindful of this pleat here. The instructions don't mention anything about adding in a little bit of interfacing, but I highly recommend it just because that specific corner is going to see a lot of wear and tear. But once the back pieces are sewn together, go ahead and pin in your pleats. Make sure everything lines up, and then you'll be stitching across the top, trying to get all those areas covered within that stitch. Though, as I said, it will get a lot of wear and tear, so definitely be mindful and interface those areas if you can. Now, at this point, I went ahead and cut open the back pleat. The instructions do say to cut open that back pleat towards the end, but I just kind of wanted to have it free just to see what it would look like. But you can keep it close if you want. But from there, you go ahead and jump on over to the collar. So because this particular piece does not call for regular iron and interfacing, everything is sewn in interfacing. So I used a muslin fabric and basted it to my collar pieces and then sewed that together to the back. Now using a muslin, interfacing definitely has its pros and cons. It does make things more stable and soft, which I like, without having like the stiffness of a regular interfacing. But once you sew on the back collar piece, you can go ahead and move on to the front. So that would be the regular shoulder dart as well as the fisheye dart, which are a little bit tricky to do, but just do one at a time. Make sure to press it as well as you can, and then you can go ahead and move on to the rest of the bodice front, or like the dress front. Take your time pinning everything as you're doing the front, because you do have those princess seams, right? So take your time, sew slowly, and then you can go ahead and press it. Use a ham if you have one, and then you can clip your seams open so everything lays flat. Now, the cool part about this particular dress is that the whole front of it is sewn up the front, so you actually are only sewing up about 3/4 on that center front seam, which means that the front bodice is completely open. So just keep that in mind as you're sewing this, that the whole front of it is going to be open, so you will need like a camisole or a dickie or something underneath the dress once you're wearing it. Oh, so at this point, I'm going ahead and starting to do the interfacing muslin for the collar pieces. So you can see here that I'm pinning that up. And you do have to remember, you do have to trim it on the outer seam allowances. You're essentially cutting off the seam allowance to make the interfacing just slightly smaller than the collar facing pieces. But go ahead, pin everything in place. And then after you've basted it across the front, you actually hand stitch it down to the seam allowances. So, you know, as I said in the intro, there is a lot of hand sewing. You know, for me, it's not a big deal. You put on a good show on Netflix and your reading glasses or your regular glasses, you can go ahead and start sewing everything in place. Now, once the interfacing is where it needs to be, you can go ahead and work on your bound buttonholes. Now, if you have not already seen the technique video as part of this series, go ahead and watch that before continuing this piece, because you want to have those bound buttonholes ready to go before moving on to any other part of the dress. The more you put them off, the harder they'll be down the road. So just make sure to do them carefully, make sure that they're measured out in the correct spot. And if you've never done a bound buttonhole, just watch the video that I made and also make a couple samples just so you feel comfortable with them before you tackle the main dress. All right, once your bound buttonholes are done, you can go ahead and attach the front of the dress to the back of the dress. Now you're going to be doing that at the shoulders and the collar first. And then you're going to do one side and then the second side, but you will be leaving the side opening, you know, like where you're going to put your little snaps on the side of your dress. Just because there's no zipper in this, like it's very traditional, and it's pulled from the 1940s, so it's pulling out so many of those techniques from the 40s, including not having a zipper, so keep that in mind. Now, I did put in a grosgrain waist stay just to help hold up the weight of the skirt. If you are not part of the sewing compendium for this particular dress, go ahead and sign up. It's in my newsletter. I talk about that grosgrain ribbon and you know how to do the little stitches and stuff like that. But once that ribbon is in place, tacked in correctly, you can go ahead and start to work on your facing pieces for your dress. Now, at this point, this is I'd say this is round 3 of the collar. So you actually be very comfortable with this at this point, right? So you're going to do your darts, you're going to sew that collar in place, and then once this is all stitched together and done up very nicely, you'll actually be reattaching this back to your dress again. So you can see me there putting that on top, getting it all situated how it's supposed to be. Few pins here and there. And make sure that, you know, as you're pinning it, this is actually very important at this point, just to make sure that your seams are lining up how they're supposed to. It's very easy to kind of, you know, shift something, you know, half an inch in one direction, and then it kind of throws everything else out of whack. So, you know, as you're pinning, you're facing to the dress. Just make sure everything lines up. See, matching up that seam. Making sure things are not stretched out. And you're ready to baste. Oh, I'm sorry, you do your base first, and then you go ahead and put in your regular stitch line. Now, once your facing is in place, you can turn that into the middle of the dress, and you can go ahead and hand stitch that facing in there closed. So you have a few little stitches here and there. And then you can go ahead and, because your facing is now attached to the bodice, you can go ahead and finish up your bound buttonhole. So this is where, you know, that technique video that I referenced earlier comes into play. You know, you're gonna go ahead and make sure that you have your bound buttonhole actually work and actually open up like it's supposed to. But as you can see, I have pins everywhere at this point. Actually, it kind of reminds me that I should probably swap out my pins. If you don't already swap out your pins like on a regular basis, highly recommended. just because you want to make sure your pins are nice and sharp for the fabric that you're trying to use. Anyway, once your bound buttonholes are sewn up, you can go ahead and move on to the sleeves. Now the sleeves are two-piece sleeves, so it does have this lovely bell sort of shape. This is actually, you know, surprisingly for 2017 when this video is being recorded, this sleeve is very popular even in modern patterns. So I think it's very cool that, you know, such an older pattern still kind of had this modern, you know, bell shape sleeve. But you're gonna go ahead and sew that sleeve, then you're gonna sew your facing pieces together. And these guys are all pretty straightforward. Just keep in mind that if you do have to make any adjustments on the sleeves, try and do them at the paper pattern level. It's very difficult to go back and change these sleeves once they're already cut and sewn, just because, you know, the way that most pattern adjustments have to be done on sleeves, they either like collapse on themselves or they spread out from the center of the sleeve. So, you know, make sure to take your time to sort that out even before you get to your real fabric. But once you have sewn the facing onto your sleeve, you're going to go ahead and hand stitch that, that sleeve hem closed by hand. And I'm using blind stitches here just so that there's tiny little pricks on the outside of it, but you really can't tell, you know, if you're looking at it. But once that sleeve is all sorted out with its facing, you can go ahead and gather the sleeve head, and you're going to be easing that sleeve into the dress. So you can see there, I'm going to match up the armpit of the sleeve to the armpit of the dress, slip that in there. So the sleeve is right side out and the dress is inside out. So just keep that in mind and make sure that your notches are lining up. So you'll see here that as I'm putting that sleeve cap in place, I'm making sure to line up everything that I can on all the notches, just because it, you know, if you don't have your notches sorted out, you're gonna get yourself all twisted up in the sleeve. And I mean twisted up, pun intended, because the sleeve can kind of get all wonky the more that you fiddle with it, especially if you don't have all your markings in there correctly. Well, at this point I am fighting with the dress because it is getting huge. So the dress is already long, the sleeves are getting tacked into place like they're supposed to be. You know, there's multiple layers on the collar. You have to imagine the collar at this point is the facing, the fashion fabric, and the inner facing, so that's getting pretty huge. But once the sleeves are in place, you can go ahead and jump on over to your shoulder pads. So I went ahead and used like a fiber fill, cut out all my little moon shapes for my shoulder pad, which is actually kind of nice to do. I'm actually going very slowly in this process because the tip of the scissors kept getting caught in the inner facing. So just take your time. If you have a rotary blade, that might be a good idea. But once all that is set up, you can go ahead and hand stitch those little moon shaped crescents on top of one another. And you can see here that I'm going to be making a little inner facing taco. You fold that in half, and then you're going to go ahead and hand stitch that closed. You can see all those tiny little stitches. And so you can see there on the right hand side there's the thing there in the shoulder pad, but on the left there is not. So you can totally see that there's a difference. But once your shoulder pads are in place, you can go ahead and start to work on your finishing techniques. So at this point I am closing up the side opening. So I used a little bit of bias tape. Now I should have looked for bias tape that was the color of the dress, but for whatever reason it didn't even occur to me, and by the time I was shooting this video, this is all I had on hand. So I just rolled with it. But luckily, you know, this little piece of bias tape is for the snaps that closes the side seam. And the way that it's sewn into place, you can hardly see it, so it worked out in the end. But you will also be doing almost like a fly for these snaps. So the fly itself is Very simple. You just kind of sew this rectangle with a side opening, and you kind of pin it in place on the opposite side of where you had the bias tape. Now the instructions for this in the regular instructions are straightforward, but just take your time because you want to be able to visualize it. So if you need to pin everything in place and turn it in on itself so you can see how it works, take the time to do that, because you don't want to be ripping things out. It just makes things so much more of a hassle later on. But you can go ahead and stitch a little fly piece in place. And then at this point, I am kind of sewing the top stitching on that fly, like that side seam fly. And then after that's all said and done, you can go ahead and hand sew your snaps in place. As I said, lots of hand sewing all over the place. And then hem up your piece. Because I'm very short, I had to hem mine 4 inches, but basically almost done. At that point, you're going to go ahead and do your collar and your facings again, and you're good to go. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was a little bit on the longer side, but there was just so much to cover and I didn't want to miss anything. So definitely leave your questions down below if you have any questions. I know there was, as I said, a lot to cover. So if you have any concerns and things that might be able to help you with, please leave them down there. I read every comment. Also, please check out the website. I do have some more detailed photos so you can see a lot of this stuff up close. You can get a better idea of a little bit more behind the scenes stuff. With that said, please like, share, subscribe, all the places, all the stuff, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.